When I found the paperwork, I didn't know what I was looking at first. It was buried under a pile of old tax documents in my parents' home office, hidden in a folder marked miscellaneous. The yellowing pages felt rough between my fingers as I skimmed through them, my eyes catching on a familiar address. It was our childhood home, the house I had grown up in, the house where I had spent countless nights studying for exams, where I had celebrated birthdays, and where my mother had once bandaged my scraped knees after I fell off my bike. But something was wrong. My name wasn't on anything. The house had been signed over entirely to my younger sister, Amelia. My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of it. I had never been told about this. All these years, my parents had made it seem like the house was a family asset, something we all had a claim to. It wasn't just property, it was part of my life. I had always assumed that one day when the time came, we would either sell it and split the money or figure out a way to keep it in the family. But instead, they had made a decision behind my back. I wasn't just left out, I had been erased. I sat down in the office chair, the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on me. I tried to calm myself, to think logically. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe there was some explanation I wasn't seeing. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of every page before carefully placing the documents back exactly as I had found them. I didn't want them to know I had seen anything, not yet. If they had kept this a secret, there had to be a reason, and I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I confronted them. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Memories of the house flooded back to me. Christmas mornings by the fireplace, late night talks in the kitchen, the day I moved away for college and promised I'd always come back. It wasn't just a house, it was home. And now, it was Amelia's. Not ours, not mine, just hers. And I had never even been given a choice. The next morning, I did what I always did when something didn't sit right with me. I started digging. I called an old family friend who used to work in real estate, someone I trusted. I sent her the documents, hoping she could help me understand them better. Within an hour, she called me back, her voice tense. "Delilah, I don't know how to tell you this, but this transfer wasn't recent. It happened 5 years ago." 5 years? My stomach dropped. That meant that all the times my parents had reassured me that the house was still part of our family, they had already given it away. Every conversation, every moment we had talked about the future of the house had been a lie. But it didn't make sense. Why hadn't they told me? Why Amelia? I thought back to that time in my life. 5 years ago, I had just started my own business, working long hours to make a name for myself. I was independent, stable, not struggling the way Amelia had been. She had dropped out of college twice, jumped from job to job, always calling my parents whenever she needed help. She was the baby of the family, the one my parents had always coddled, the one who could do no wrong. And now she had the house. I needed to hear it from them. That evening, I went to my parents' house for dinner, acting normal. The scent of my mother's homemade lasagna filled the air as she set the table, her face warm with a smile that now felt forced. Amelia was already seated, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. My father sat at the head of the table, flipping through some papers, completely unaware that everything had changed. I waited until we had all eaten, until the conversation had drifted from small talk to the usual family gossip. Then, as casually as I could, I leaned back in my chair and asked, "So, when were you planning on telling me about the house?" Silence. My mother's fork clinked against her plate. My father cleared his throat. Amelia looked up from her phone, her eyes darting between them, then back to me. "What are you talking about?" my mother finally asked, her voice carefully measured. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table, turning the screen toward them. The scanned images of the paperwork stared back at them. My mother went pale. My father sighed, rubbing his temples. Amelia, she smirked. She actually smirked. "Oh," she said, tilting her head. "So you found out." Something inside me snapped. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't some oversight. They all knew, and they had been hoping I'd never find out. My hands clenched into fists under the table, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had walked into this conversation hoping for some kind of explanation, something that would make this betrayal easier to swallow. But Amelia's smirk, my mother's guilty silence, and my father's tired sigh told me everything I needed to. They hadn't just given her the house. They had done it knowing full well that it would hurt me. And worse, they had planned to never tell me. I took a deep breath, my voice steady. So when exactly did you all decide that I didn't matter? That I wasn't even worth a conversation? Delilah, don't be dramatic, my mother said quickly, her voice taking on that sickeningly sweet tone she always used when she wanted me to back down. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? I shot back. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you signed my childhood home away to Amelia and just forgot to mention it to me. Amelia rolled her eyes, picking at her nails like this was nothing more than an inconvenience. It made sense, she said casually. You don't even live here anymore. You have your own place. I needed stability. Mom and Dad wanted to help me, I laughed. A short, humorless sound. You needed stability? Amelia, I have spent my entire life watching you get handed everything while I worked for everything I have. And now, you get the house too? I turned back to my parents. You could have told me. You should have told me. My father finally spoke, his voice low and gruff. We didn't think you'd care, Delilah. You're successful, you're independent. Amelia needed the help more than you did. There it was, the unspoken rule of our family. Because I wasn't struggling, I didn't deserve anything. Because I had worked hard and built my own life, I was punished for it. Meanwhile, Amelia, who had never held a job for more than 6 months, was rewarded with a house. I shook my head in disbelief. You do realize that house was supposed to be for both of us, right? You spent my entire life telling me that we would share it, that it was still part of the family. But you lied. For 5 years, you let me believe something that wasn't true. We didn't lie, my mother protested weakly. We just made a decision that was best for the family. You mean best for Amelia, I corrected. My mother flinched, but she didn't argue. My father looked away, and Amelia just shrugged. It's done, Delilah. There's no point in making a big deal out of it now. That was when I knew. They didn't regret it. They weren't sorry. They hadn't even considered how I might feel about it. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was just the capable one, the one who didn't need anything, the one who was supposed to smile and nod while Amelia got everything handed to her. But they had underestimated me. Because while I may not have been the favorite, I wasn't stupid. And I had already found something they hadn't expected. The paperwork I had discovered, it wasn't just a deed transfer. There was a clause, one my parents clearly hadn't noticed when they signed it. And that clause, it changed everything. I stood up, grabbing my phone from the table. You know what? You're right, Amelia. There's no point in making a big deal out of this now. She blinked, clearly surprised by my sudden agreement. My mother let out a relieved sigh. My father relaxed in his chair. They thought I was backing down. They had no idea that I had already made a call to my lawyer that afternoon. They had no idea that in just a few days, they were going to get a letter informing them that the finalized transfer wasn't as finalized as they thought. Because the clause I had found? It stated that any major property transfer within the family required both siblings to sign off on it. And I never had. The realization settled over me like a calm wave before a storm. They had thought they could make this decision without me, that I would never find out, or if I did, I wouldn't have any power to fight it. But they had been sloppy. They had signed something without reading the fine print, and now, for the first time, I held the upper hand. I left the house that night without another word. My mother called after me, asking if I was upset, but I ignored her. Amelia didn't even bother pretending to care. She had gotten what she wanted, at least she thought she had. But she had no idea that legally, the house was still in limbo. The drive home felt like a blur. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, the dismissive way they had spoken to me, the way my parents had justified their decision as if I was just an outsider looking in. It wasn't about the house anymore, it was about what it represented. The fact that I had never truly been considered equal in their eyes. I had always been the responsible one, the one they didn't have to worry about, so they had decided I didn't need anything at all. I spent the next 2 days gathering everything I needed. I met with my lawyer, who confirmed what I had suspected. The transfer was legally invalid unless I had signed off on it. Since I never had, the deed was still in a contested state. which meant Amelia didn't legally own the house yet. And because of that, I had options. "Do you want to fight for ownership?" my lawyer asked. I thought about it. Did I want the house? Did I want to live in it, knowing how much pain was tied to it now? I didn't want to keep it for myself, but I wanted them to feel what it was like to have something they thought was secure ripped away from them. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be blindsided, just like they had done to me. So, I made my decision. "I don't want the house," I said, "but I want them to know they don't have it either." 3 days later, I sent my parents an email with the legal documents attached. My message was simple. I recently came across the paperwork regarding the house transfer and noticed a legal issue. Since I never signed off on this transfer, the deed is still legally unsettled. My lawyer has advised me that without my consent, Amelia does not have full ownership. I'm sure you didn't intend to overlook this detail, so I wanted to bring it to your attention before I take the next steps to formally contest the transfer. I didn't expect a response right away, but within an hour, my phone rang. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. Then my father called. Then Amelia. One after another, their names lit up my screen. I ignored every single one. By the time the sun set, my inbox was flooded with emails from my parents, ranging from panicked to defensive. They insisted it was a misunderstanding. They begged me to let it go. My mother even tried to guilt trip me, writing, "Delilah, please don't do this. We're family. We never meant to hurt you." I laughed when I read that. Now suddenly, family mattered. Now they wanted to act like I was important. But when they had signed that paperwork 5 years ago, they hadn't considered my feelings at all. They had left me out without a second thought. And now, it was their turn to feel what that was like. The next morning, I woke up to more missed calls and unread messages. My mother had switched from pleading to angry. My father, ever the reasonable one, had sent a long-winded email about how this was just a paperwork issue and that I was being dramatic for dragging it out. Amelia, on the other hand, had sent me a single message that summed up everything I needed to know about her. "You're such a jealous brat. You don't even want the house. You're just doing this to spite me." I smirked at my screen. Amelia was right about one thing. I didn't want the house. But I wasn't going to let them walk all over me either. If they had just been honest from the beginning, if they had included me in the decision, I probably would have let it go, but they hadn't. They had schemed behind my back, thinking I would never find out. And now that I had, they were scrambling. Later that afternoon, I got a call from my lawyer. "They finally responded to our formal notice," she said. "Your parents are trying to negotiate." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Negotiate what?" "They want you to sign the papers now, retroactively." I almost laughed. Of course they did. They wanted me to quietly sign away my rights and pretend none of this had ever happened. They wanted me to be the good daughter again, the one who made things easy for them, but that wasn't happening. "No," I said firmly, "not without consequences." I could hear the smile in my lawyer's voice. "That's what I thought you'd say." The next day, my parents finally caved and called me together. I answered this time, mostly to see what they had to say. My mother sounded exhausted. "Delilah, sweetheart, we just want to fix this," she said. "There's no need for lawyers. Let's talk this out as a family." "You mean like how you talked to me when you made this decision in the first place?" I asked, my voice calm. Silence. Then my father sighed heavily. "We didn't think you'd react like this." "That's the problem," I said. "You didn't think about me at all." "Fine," he snapped. "What do you want? Money? Do you want us to buy you out?" I smiled. Now we were getting somewhere. They were desperate. They wanted me to go away, to stop making trouble. And if they thought they could just throw some money at me to shut me up, they were about to be very disappointed. "I want the house sold," I said simply. "What?" Amelia's voice cut in, high-pitched and panicked. I stayed firm. "Sell the house, split the money. That's the fair thing to do, right?" My mother gasped. "But Amelia lives there. Then she can buy it," I replied. "If she wants it so badly, she can buy it at market value," Amelia exploded. "You're ruining my life. You don't even need the money, Delilah. You just want to take it away from me." I let her rant. Let her scream. My parents tried to calm her down, tried to talk me into backing off, but I stood my ground. They had taken something from me without asking. and now they were going to learn what that felt like. By the end of the call, I had made my position clear. Either they sold the house and we split the money, or I would legally contest the entire transfer. And if I did that, it could tie up the property for years, making it impossible for Amelia to do anything with it. I gave them 2 weeks to decide. For the first time in my life, I was in control. And I wasn't going to let them forget it. The next 2 weeks were eerily quiet. No texts, no calls, not even a passive-aggressive email from my mother trying to guilt-trip me. It was almost laughable. After all their anger and demands, they had suddenly gone silent. But I knew what was happening. They weren't ignoring me. They were scrambling. I imagined them sitting around the dining table, whispering about what to do next. My father trying to come up with a logical way to convince me to back down. My mother probably crying and talking about how I was tearing the family apart. And Amelia? She was undoubtedly furious, pacing the room, throwing tantrums about how I had ruined everything. I almost wished I could see it. Then, 3 days before my deadline, my father called. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, then my mother, then Amelia. I waited, letting the tension build. I knew what was coming. Finally, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line was simple. "Let's talk." I opened it, reading slowly. "Delilah, we've talked it over and we think we can come to an agreement that works for everyone. Please come over for dinner on Sunday so we can discuss it in person. Let's settle this like a family." There it was. The invitation, the trap. They wanted me in their house, surrounded, outnumbered. They wanted me softened by the familiar smells of my mother's cooking, lulled into nostalgia, guilted into letting this go. They thought I would sit at that table, hear them out, and suddenly feel bad for making things complicated. They thought they could manipulate me, again. But this time, I was ready. On Sunday, I arrived at my parents' house exactly at 6 p.m. The moment I stepped inside, I knew I was right. The house smelled like my mother's roast chicken. My father was seated at the head of the table like a judge presiding over a case. And Amelia? She was leaning back in her chair, smug as ever, tapping her nails against her wine glass, like she had already won. I took my seat, folded my hands, and waited. My mother started, her voice soft. "Delilah, sweetheart, we don't want to fight anymore." I nodded, waiting. My father leaned forward. "We've thought about it, and we're willing to compromise. Amelia will keep the house, but we'll give you a financial settlement to make things fair." Ah, so that was their plan. Pay me off. They were hoping a check would make me forget how they had treated me, how they had cut me out. I tilted my head. "How much?" My father looked slightly uncomfortable. "We were thinking $10,000. I stared at him, then let out a short laugh. "You think 10 grand makes up for this?" My mother flinched. Amelia smirked. "It's more than you deserve." I turned to her, my expression calm. "You should be very careful about what you think I deserve, Amelia." My father cleared his throat. "We're trying to be fair, Delilah." "No," I said, my voice firm. "You're trying to buy my silence, and you're doing a terrible job of it." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Sweetheart, we just want this to be over." I set down my fork. "It will be when the house is sold." Amelia slammed her glass onto the table. "You're such a selfish—" I cut her off, my voice ice cold. "Selfish? You mean like keeping a house that was supposed to belong to both of us? You mean like lying to me for years and hoping I never found out?" Silence. My father ran a hand over his face. "Delilah, listen." "No," I interrupted. "You listen. You made this mess, and now you're going to fix it. Sell the house, and we split the money. Or I take this to court, and trust me, I won't lose." I let my words hang in the air. My father clenched his jaw. My mother wiped at her eyes. Amelia glared at me like she wanted to set me on fire. I pushed back my chair and stood. "Let me know your decision. You have 2 days." Then, without another word, I walked out. I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like the one in control, and I had no intention of giving that up. 2 days passed without a word. I wasn't surprised. My family had always operated on control, They expected people to fold under pressure, to cave in when emotions ran high. But this time, I wasn't budging. They knew it too. That's why they were stalling. They were hoping I'd get tired of fighting, that I'd second-guess myself, that I'd feel guilty enough to let it go. They were wrong. On the morning of the deadline, my lawyer sent me an update. My parents had finally responded through their own attorney. They've agreed to list the house for sale, she said. They're not happy about it, but they don't have a choice. I let out a slow breath. It was done. By the evening, my father finally called me himself. This time, I answered. His voice was tense. "We hope you're happy," he said bitterly. I leaned against my kitchen counter, completely calm. "I am," he exhaled sharply. "Your mother is heartbroken." "She should be. She did this to herself." Silence. Then a long pause before he spoke again. "I never thought you'd do this to your family." I smiled slightly. "Funny, that's exactly what I thought when I found out you did this to me." He had no response to that. I didn't give him time to come up with one. "Good luck with the sale," I said, then ended the call. A month later, the house was sold. It was a strange feeling, knowing that the place I had grown up in was no longer ours. But in the end, I realized it had never really been mine to begin with. My parents had made that choice years ago when they decided to cut me out. They had made their decision, and now they were facing the consequences. Amelia, of course, was furious. She raged about how unfair it was, how I had ruined everything. But I didn't care. She had never cared when the unfairness worked in her favor. Now she was learning what it felt like to be on the other side. As for my parents, they never apologized. They never admitted they were wrong, but that didn't matter anymore. Because for the first time, I had stood up for myself. For the first time, I had refused to be the afterthought. And that was worth more than any house could ever be.